What is it?
I was reading about a very gruesome way of punishing people in the Viking Age. Christ.
So why in the devil are you laughing?
Tell me, was there any particular punishment you had to go through?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, obviously, but any particular painful or strange one?
Oh yes, there was once this cage, and they threw me right in it. And then, there was this beauty.
That doesn't seem out of this world.
Wait, there is more. I grabbed it like this.
Sounds good so far.
Hey, I was in chains, and so was she.
Nice.
What a beast!
Oh, Mr. Thorson, a beast. Women are people too.
Who said anything about a woman? It was a bear!
What? A bear? You shagged a bear?
What? Shaking? No. It was wrestling!
Right. Hello my good friends, how are you? My name is AlÞing and today I'm going to talk about Viking justice. How the Vikings did settle disputes, if there was any sort of judicial system, how the law was applied, the type of punishments delivered to criminals of all sorts, etc. I hope you enjoy this video. During the Viking Age, Scandinavia was a complex collection of countries, and even within each country, unification wasn't a concept the peoples of Scandinavia were used to. The society of medieval Scandinavia was marked by a very noticeable hierarchy. Warriors, farmers, thralls, which were paid workers but regarded as slaves, as property, and then there was the local elite. Viking Age Scandinavia was marked by internal conflicts, disputes, clan feuds, and the conflicts between political factions. This society was structured by a range of conflicts that had everything to go wrong and fall into chaos, but what everyone had in common was a deep desire for fairness, deeply personal values rooted in honorable actions, and a sense of justice. It was the personal values of these people that saved them from their own society. And because there was this deep sense of justice and above all being fair in judgment, the Nordic peoples created a sort of organism that would deliver justice and at the same time be the only thing that could unite the society and bring peace terms to each injured party. The Þing. The Þing was the assembly, a sort of local parliament and court administrated by law speakers. This could be a physical structure or a gathering where the representatives of each family would gather and the most prominent members of the society to solve disputes and make political decisions. The Þing itself had a great evolution, so to speak, a great development of the judicial system and the creation of laws in general during the Viking Age. This public gathering would provide the opportunity for all people to express their views and settle disputes. And when I mean all people, I mean the free men. It's clear that women also attended these local assemblies and most likely had an indirect influence upon the decisions of men, but they did not have a definite final decision and their voice wasn't taken into account when an agreement was created. So it was very hard for women to find the justice they wished within the local assembly, the Þing. So they would have to find justice through other means. But we shall talk about that further ahead. We have to take in mind that the Þing was a perfectly good attempt to unite people which by nature were not that united when it came to settle internal disputes. Viking Age peoples of Scandinavia would unite under a specific objective concerning war, raids, enhancing wealth by invading other regions. Unification was a concept better rooted in the warrior class. But in general, everybody else who wasn't a warrior didn't have this concept of unification with people that did not belong to their families. There was no sense and no desire for unification with people that were from outside the family environment. So the Þing was fundamental to slowly interiorize the concept of unification in the community, which is why the Þing also served as a place to host religious festivals and celebrations, another way of getting people together in momentary peace. Of course, we can also speak about great halls. Certainly, they were the physical structures through which local elites exercised their power, expressed authority, also settled disputes and conducted political and religious events. But great halls represented the power of the local elite, and the power exercised there was only for the best interests of the local elite, while the Þing represented a neutral ground where each person could settle their disputes, not with the local lord directly, but settling disputes amongst themselves, reaching an agreement in the most civilized manner possible. I've spoken earlier about the general reluctance to a sense of unification on the part of the medieval Scandinavian peoples. And I would like to quickly develop that so you might understand the actual importance of the Þing, the assembly, on the collective mind of Viking Age Scandinavians. You see, in Germanic and Scandinavian societies since the Bronze Age until the Viking period, these societies were greatly divided by clans, by small communities scattered all over the geographical reality. The economy was very much based on the private property, in the capacity of the family to settle in a place and take advantage of the resources of the area. It wasn't like in Bronze Age and Iron Age societies of Western Europe, where the production served and was kept in the cities, clear settlements where the administration was held and the economy developed around the settlement. The economy in Germanic and Scandinavian regions was characterized by a great individualism. Farmsteads here and there, and that is quite clear on the archaeological strata of the Viking period in Scandinavia. There wasn't a great developed industry. It was all about the family nucleus, the household, which is why we know close to nothing about the Old Norse festivities and religious performances, because most of them were held in private domains. So this entire individual economy, scattered all over the place, didn't create a clear sense of unification. Unification was within the family and not the unification of an entire population. It wasn't like in classical Rome, for instance, both the Republic and the Empire. The wealth of Rome was greatly based on landowners who had to answer to the central government, to the highest authority. In Scandinavia, there was a lot more freedom in economy. It was all about the family, the clan, and in a few cases extended to a larger community whose purpose in unification was to trade. But in general, there wasn't a large sense of unification by Germanic and Scandinavian peoples, which is why the Þing, the assembly, was crucial in the development of unification. This physical space not only was the assembly where people could passively settle their disputes, but also a place of gathering, trading, to conduct religious ceremonies, to establish social ties, to find a wife, to create alliances, to demonstrate power, and of course to dictate law and judgment. But usually the method to solve a dispute would be to pay a fair amount to the injured party. This was a good way to express one's wealth and power, but also creates another problem. The wealthy would always have means to pay for the injury committed, which gave them the opportunity to act in revenge indirectly, and then they just had to pay a specific amount to the injured party. Let me give you an example, a quick one. Directly doing the deed, you would be blamed for it, no escape, and we shall see further ahead punishments and other means of settling disputes. So, to avoid being punished by a deed, a person could send out someone else to do a deed, usually a thrall, a paid worker regarded as property. This thrall would assassinate another family's thrall or kill their cattle or something of the sort. Because the thrall was regarded as property, it was the thrall's owner that would be blamed, but the owner, the lord, couldn't be severely blamed and punished for the deed of another person. So the lord would pay an amount to compensate the loss of the other party. But the other party had already had a great blow on their economy by losing property. And occasionally the amount paid would not fully cover the loss. And it wasn't really fair, was it? The lord was acting out of malice, but using indirect methods and escaping with impunity. So this was one of the great failures of the Þing, which led people to settle their disputes in other ways, in private ways, often creating blood feuds and endless wars between families from generation to generation, often using second and third parties to do the deeds. In the sagas, this was often the method women used to seek out justice. Women had no real voice in the assemblies, and if families had disputes, it was up to the men to settle disputes amongst themselves. If there were strong ties of friendship between men, the disputes would pacifically be settled. But women would disapprove and wanted justice, revenge. So often what happened was the use of subtle but very deadly methods to seek out private justice, such as sending assassins. I would like very much to recommend you to read Njáls Saga. It's the endless blood feud between two women of different families whose husbands were friends and always settled things in the most peaceful way possible, and also according to the Thing's laws. But from behind, their wives moved the pieces of the game in the war of families, and a chain of events and endless killing crosses generations. The Thing was composed by a sort of jury, whose number would vary according to the seriousness of the crime. The jury would be composed by freemen, and with at least 12 years of age. That was the minimum age required to be part of the jury. This jury would listen to both sides of a dispute, the testimony from the injured party, the accused, and relevant witnesses. Of course, the jury would often be influenced by one party or the other, or by the chieftain who attended the Thing. But even so, there would be a person who would advise both the chieftain and everybody else in the Thing, the law speaker. The law speaker, or the law sayer, might well have been the most remarkable figure in the Thing. There were no written laws, you see, so past laws and decisions would be memorized by the law speaker, who would advise everybody, and his final decision would be taken into account considerably. The laws created, decisions made, sentences passed at each Thing would be committed to memory by one single individual at each Thing. Of course, nowadays we know much about the laws and how things were conducted because eventually they were written down. One of the very first law books written was the Jónsbók, the Icelandic law code written by Jón Hennarsson in 1280. He was a law speaker. The most important disputes were discussed at the Þing, or the AlÞing in the case of Iceland. The crimes were normally tried at the local level of regional laws dictated by the things of a certain region. The great majority of disputes concerned property, martial affairs, and affairs regarding honor, the breaking of arrangements and breaking of oaths, and, of course, murder investigation. But not everybody resorted to the Þing to seek justice. There were other ways of punishment. We have already spoken about paying with money, paying a fine. Every possible thing in the Nordic society of the Viking Age had a price, including people. When setting a fine, a lot of things were taken into consideration, such as the status of the individual and their ability to pay, coming to a fair arrangement, a proportionate amount that would be possible for the criminal to pay and also just for the injured party to receive. This fine would be split among the injured party, the community, and the local chieftain, which often led to corruption. So sometimes people preferred other ways they deemed to be just. For instance, trial by fire to prove one's innocence. It could range from walking across hot coals, carrying heated rocks, or placing their hands into boiling water to pick a hot iron or a coin. This last one was greatly used by the Franks to prove innocence. And after 3 days, if the wounds were clean and without infection, it would be taken as a sign of the gods that the person was innocent and immediately set free. Mind that this method was introduced only by the end of the Viking period with the conversion to Christianity, but still adopted by the Vikings. There was a particular gruesome way to punish thralls. Thralls could range from paid workers to slaves captured in raids, or to members of the community condemned to slavery to pay for their crime, as we shall see ahead. But all these people enter in the category of thralls. If thralls attempted murder or even succeeded in killing their masters, they were condemned to mutilation, cutting their arms and legs, but allowed to live as long as possible to suffer. This was a warning to other thralls to ponder if indeed rebellion would be a good idea. So, speaking of slavery, some thralls were members of the community who had committed a serious crime or had some sort of debt they could not pay. This last one was a very common method during the early Middle Ages throughout Europe. I mean, especially during the feudal period, giving yourself to slavery and work for a lord as a means of paying a debt, or to go on living, having shelter and food. When the Roman Empire fell, for instance, many landowners who lost their wealth would submit themselves to work for another landlord to be able to survive. During the Viking Age, slaves had no rights. They had to obey. That was the only duty. It wasn't a crime for a master to kill their slaves. And this particular law comes from Germania during the Iron Age. Tacitus himself recorded this. Although to the pre-Roman Germanic, slaves were treated almost as equals, and some even had their own houses and lived in relative freedom. But if their master for some reason wanted to kill them, they would without penalty, because slaves were seen as property, almost as cattle. Almost, because cattle had some rights. One of the other ways to punish people was banishment. And by Norse standards, this was the ultimate price to pay. Being dishonest, dishonorable, was reason enough to be banished from the community. I mean, there are some cases of people who broke oaths, which was a serious crime, but in some cases people had to literally build an archway made of stone and pass beneath it without it collapsing. If it didn't crumble down into pieces, they were innocent. But this might be something for sheer amusement. If the person was sentenced to be put outside the law, the person became lawless, therefore with no rights, not protected by the laws of man. It was almost as a death sentence. But what we have to take in mind is that there were two kinds of banishment. One was to be banished for a period of 3 years, and the person could still keep property and possessions to return to. But of course, that doesn't mean after 3 years the possessions would actually be there unless another family member took care of them, a wife, for instance. And then there was the other type of banishment, forever, to be fully outlawed and lose everything. Full banishment meant that the person became a vargr, a wolf, or monster, depending on the context. A vargr could be hunted down like a wolf. But in most cases, this perpetual banishment was for murderers or for people who committed a serious crime in hallowed places or sanctuaries. We have to take into consideration that to the Norse there was a clear difference between manslaughter and murder. After the act of killing a person, if the killer announced the deed publicly, it was considered manslaughter, a crime that could be atoned for with wergild, paying the price of the worth of the dead person. If there was no announcement, if the killer tried to hide the deed, it was considered murder. There was no honor and no honesty trying to get away with murder. On that case, the person would be outlawed and became a morvargr, literally killer wolf, a murderer. This is more or less like killing in self-defense and then killing someone for no good damn reason whatsoever, just for the pleasure of killing. But the punishment for premeditated murder wasn't always banishment. The great majority of the occasions it was punishable by death. Beheading was the most common form of execution. And then we have duels, which were seen as one of the best ways to solve local disputes amongst the Norse. Holmgang, a ritual duel, literally fighting for your rights, and the most effective way of settling disputes. The collective consciousness of the people from the Viking Age society was filled with senses of honor and pride. So Holmgang was a great way to test one's skills, to prove valor and honor in a trial by combat. Holmgang was a highly ritualistic act filled with rules and laws dictated by the Þing, the local assembly. Because before the introduction of Holmgang, trial by combat was called Einvigi. Einvigi had no rules, no laws, no moderators, and even the choices of weapon were random. It was a way to prevent blood feuds between families that could lead to the destruction of an entire community due to endless acts of killing. So everything was settled in single combat. However, Einvigi often ended with the death of someone, and then a payment was required to compensate the family of the victim. And like this, the matter was settled. So, to avoid this bloodshed and violence, and of course families would not be pleased with simply having been paid the price of the lost person and then more blood feuds, Holmgang was introduced. The fights were no longer to the death. It had a set of rules, moderators, laws were to be taken seriously, and so disputes were settled in a less violent way. Of course, this brought other problems, because the loser had to pay something to the winner, of course. So a lot of warriors saw in Holmgang a really profitable way of life and would challenge everyone they saw it would be easy targets and get money from them, possessions and even lands. Of course, after being challenged, a person could call for backup and find somebody else to fight for them, but it was always a risk. Maybe one of these days I shall explore a bit more about the Holmgang and how things were conducted. Suffice it to say, a lot of people took advantage of someone's inability to fight to increase their personal wealth, and this led to other problems. Before this video comes to an end, I would like to refer that if we look into mythology, into a particular account, we might perceive the sense of honor and pride implicit in the Nordic mind. The god Tyr, who lost his hand as a pledge. It's interesting to notice that in many cultures, losing one's hand was the punishment for breaking oaths. Tyr loses his hand to the wolf Fenrir. Tyr was innocent, but for the sake of order and to play his part in the plans of the gods to bind Fenrir, Tyr had to lie to the great wolf. A necessary lie to keep the balance, but a lie nonetheless. He sacrifices his hand in the name of his honor. He made promises to the wolf, promises that were lies, and so in the end the punishment is the loss of a hand. His honor was at stake, so he willingly paid the price. I think this mythological account is a good example of the sense of justice rooted in the Viking society. Oaths had been pledged to Fenrir, and as such they had to be fulfilled. The oaths were hollow and broken, and so Tyr saw the sacrifice of his hand as the only way in which justice could be delivered. Honor, bravery, strength, justice and fairness, all these traits are implicit in this myth and reflect the Viking sense of justice. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and April.